this lecture, we're going to look at how the respiratory system is controlled, what it is that stimulates breathing, especially when we are not aware of it, so the unconscious portions of our breathing. So respiratory rate and depth are both controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So that's involuntary control coming from the unconscious portions of the brain. In the medulla, we have the respiratory center composed of two groups of interneurons. The ventral respiratory group that sets and controls the basic rhythm of our unconscious breathing, and the dorsal respiratory group that is responsible for stimulating the inspiratory muscles, especially the diaphragm. And then in the pons, there's the pontine respiratory group, which contributes to the rhythm of breathing because it limits how deeply we can breathe in. So this is where we have reflexive control that limits inspiration. So to get sort of things going to really understand what's happening with the respiratory system, we need to do a little bit of physics. So first, what I'm showing here is a very old school device used for measuring air pressure. So you would take a cylinder of glass, make a vacuum in that cylinder of glass, and then rest it in a dish of mercury, and air pressure will push down on the mercury, causing the mercury to rise up into this vacuum tube. The height of the column then tells us how much air pressure there is. So if you measure it in inches, which is the way air pressure is reported, say on the news, the air pressure at sea level is about 30 inches, so 29.92 inches. If you measure that in the metric system, that's 76 centimeters or 760 millimeters. So, 760 millimeters. Sorry about the noise in the background. It's a warm day, so I have my windows open here. And I think somebody's mowing their lawn or blowing leaves or something. So anyway, meanwhile, back at our discussion of air pressure. So air pressure is caused by the huge amount of atmosphere that is pushing down on us. So this is not to scale, but if this is the Earth, there's an envelope of atmosphere around the Earth, and the weight of all those molecules in the air press down, creating air pressure. And so the air pressure that we feel can be attributed to the different gases that are in the air. So for instance, 21% of the atmosphere around the Earth is made up of oxygen. And so the portion of air pressure that is attributable to oxygen is 160 millimeters mercury. So that's the percentage of that 760 millimeters mercury that is produced by oxygen in the air. Carbon dioxide is a very small part of the atmosphere, so a very small part of air pressure is attributable to carbon dioxide. Whereas nitrogen gas, which is an inert gas that has no biological effect, is the largest portion of the gases around the Earth, and it produces about 593 millimeters of that total 760 millimeters of pressure on us. So we talk about these percentages or these proportions of the pressure of air as the partial pressure of that gas. And so when we look at concentrations of gases, whether they're in the air or dissolved in liquids, we can talk about the partial pressure of each of the gases that is dissolved in a liquid or that's found in a column of air. So partial pressure and concentration are very, very similar ideas. So that's the piece that I want you to understand from that. When we talk about the partial pressure of a particular gas in the blood or in the air, that's very much like talking about the concentration of that gas that's in the air. Okay, so there's the first thing. The second thing is that when you have a gas dissolved in a fluid, it will always be at the same partial pressure of that gas in the air around the fluid. So fluids reflect the partial pressure of gas in a fluid reflects the partial pressure of the gases that are found in the air. So air and fluids quickly will adjust and equilibrate so that they are equal, so that the partial pressures in those two different media are going to be the same. Okay, so that's the physics, and now for a little bit of chemistry. When you have carbon dioxide and you dissolve it in water, for instance, in the plasma portion of blood, you produce an acid called carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is H2CO3. H2CO3 is acidic because the hydrogen ion will disassociate from the bicarbonate ion. And so this hydrogen ion is what makes the fluids acidic. So anytime you dissolve any amount of carbon dioxide into a water, you're going to make carbonic acid, which will then dissociate and make the pH of whatever fluid you have more acidic. It will cause the pH to drop. So pH is a really weird scale. Anything from 0 to 7 is considered acidic. Anything from 7 to 14 is considered basic. And the more you go high, the more basic. The more you go low, the more acidic a fluid is. So carbon dioxide dissolved in fluids turns those fluids acidic because we produce carbonic acid. And so I want you to, this is an important equation. It's going to come back again when we get into acid-base balancing. So I want you to learn that equation. Okay, so now let's talk about control. In the medulla, there are chemosensors. They're called the central chemoreceptors because they're associated with the central nervous system. And they're chemoreceptors because they're monitoring the chemistry of a fluid, cerebrospinal fluid in this case. So the pH of the cerebrospinal fluid, as we've just talked about, depends on the amount of CO2 that's dissolved in the cerebrospinal fluid. And it depends then on the amount of CO2 that's dissolved in the blood, because remember, blood and cerebrospinal fluid, we make CSF from the cerebrospinal fluid. Capillaries go right near cerebrospinal fluid, so very quickly acidic blood will result in acidic cerebrospinal fluid. Now, hydrogen ions don't cross the blood-brain barrier, but carbon dioxide can very easily. So CO2 enters the CSF from the blood, and the dissolved CO2 creates carbonic acid and releases its hydrogen ion, making the cerebrospinal fluid acidic. So in response, autonomic stimulation from the medulla will affect both the breathing rate and tidal volume. So you'll breathe faster and you'll breathe more deeply. So breathing rate will increase and the depth of our breathing will increase. So deep breathing, that's deep breathing is what I'm talking about, versus very light breathing, which I won't even demonstrate because you can't hear it. So the more carbon dioxide then that we breathe away, then CO2 levels will decrease. And that's negative feedback because we're removing carbon dioxide from the blood. Oops, we're taking carbon dioxide from the blood because because increased CO2 will cause increased breathing rate and depth, resulting in decreased CO2, which will then result in decreased breathing and decreased depth of breathing. So if we increase our breathing rate, we're going to lose more CO2. We breathe it away. And along the way, oxygen levels are going to increase. So we control our rate and depth of breathing basically through CO2, not through oxygen. Most people would tell you, oh yeah, it's the amount of oxygen in your blood that determines how quickly you're breathing. You know, the idea being that if oxygen were low, then you're going to breathe more so that you get more oxygen. But actually, it's high carbon dioxide causing acidic blood, or causing acidic CSF, that stimulates then increased breathing rates that then result in decreased carbon dioxide again. So it's negative feedback systems around carbon dioxide that result in control of the rate of breathing. So that's why if you go for a run, at the end of your run, or even in the middle of your run, you'll be breathing more rapidly and more heavily, because you're going to be you're going to be introducing higher levels of carbon dioxide into your blood, which will result in higher levels of carbon dioxide going into the CSF, which will stimulate those central chemoreceptors in the medulla to trigger more rapid and greater depth of breathing. And because we're breathing more rapidly and more deeply, then CO2 levels will go down, but along the way, oxygen levels go up. Okay, so central chemoreception has nothing to do with oxygen levels, and changes in oxygen levels in the blood are not going to have any effect on central chemoreception. But we also have peripheral chemoreceptors. These peripheral chemoreceptors are found in the aorta, right there, and in the carotid arteries. So why carotid arteries? Hopefully that makes sense. We're sending blood to the brain. We definitely want to keep close tabs on the blood that we send to the brain. And then the aorta, that's going to be tracking the blood that's going out to the body. So the carotid bodies in the carotid arteries and the aortic bodies in the aorta, they monitor the level of oxygen that's in the blood. And when they sense low oxygen, then they send signals up to the medulla oblongata, and autonomic stimulation will increase breathing rate and tidal volume. Wait, you say. You just told us oxygen has nothing to do with the rate at which we breathe and the depth of our breathing, and then you tell us this. Well, here's why oxygen has very little to do with it. You have to have a very, very low partial pressure of oxygen in your blood in order to get these chemoreceptors to respond. It has to drop by 50% off of what is normal in order for the chemoreceptors to trigger this reflexive response. So our primary means then of controlling oxygen in the blood is all done through the central chemoreception, which is all operating off of pH changes which are stimulated by carbon dioxide. It's only when things get really dire that oxygen chemoreceptors will stimulate more rapid breathing or deeper breathing. So, bottom line, breathing reflex is driven by carbon dioxide concentrations. So how can we get these oxygen receptors to do work for us? Well, you could try this. You could hyperventilate. So very rapid, shallow breathing is hyperventilation. This will cause a lot of carbon dioxide to be blown off, enough that perhaps you can kind of disable for a time central chemoreception, because it'll take a long time for that carbon dioxide to build back up again to levels that will trigger central chemoreception. Then, if somewhere along the way, then after you hyperventilate, you pass out because oxygen levels got really low because you didn't bother to breathe, because you didn't remember to breathe, then O2 levels could drop low enough that we turn breathing, or turn autonomic breathing, back on again. But that's kind of what it's going to take to get oxygen to be the controller. You have to really get rid of lots and lots of the carbon dioxide. So this is where people who do free diving to really, really deep depths can have a problem, because if they hyperventilate first to really load up on oxygen in their blood, they can get to the point where they're concentrated more on that if they're diving downward and they're holding off their breathing reflex, they could get to oxygen levels that are low enough in their blood that they become unconscious. Oxygen levels continue to drop, and then these oxygen chemoreceptors will turn on, causing them to breathe underwater, and they can die. So this has resulted in drowning of some. This using hyperventilation as a means to charge up on oxygen has resulted in drowning in people who do this kind of deep free diving. So what are some other ways that we control, or what other controls are there on respiration? There's the mechanoreceptor reflexes of the inflation reflex. So as we breathe in, we reach a point where we can no longer expand the lungs, but it would still be possible for us, if we could, to be able to contract the external intercostal muscles. But we have a reflex that's moderated at the pons that prevents us from further contraction of those external intercostal muscles, because the lungs are realizing, hey, we've been stretched too much. So overstretching the lungs causes a slowdown in the ability to contract the external intercostal muscles, preventing us from damaging the lungs by overinflating them. Emotional upset, fear, pain, those can also have an effect upon our breathing rate. So when we're angry, we can breathe. We're so or if we're scared, we can get some effects on our breathing rate as well. And finally, we have voluntary controls. So we can think ourselves, we can think, I think I'd like to breathe a little more rapidly, and there we start breathing more rapidly. Okay, so there you have it. Chemoreception is the primary control of our unconscious breathing, centered around carbon dioxide, through that carbon dioxide carbonic acid equation that I asked you to learn. Partial pressures of oxygen are the same thing as talking about concentrations of oxygen. So as you're reading in the book and they discuss partial pressures, you can think to yourself concentrations, and a higher partial pressure would equal a higher concentration of gases. And then finally, there are other ways through which we control the respiratory system, including the mechanoreceptor inflation reflex that prevents us from over-expanding the lungs, emotional upset or excitement, and through voluntary conscious thought, we can also control respiration. Any questions? You know what to do.